Okay, first question we're going to talk about today is how do the bryophytes compare? Now we know from the table we left off with on Monday that all bryophytes are plants. True or false? All bryophytes are plants. I know that was awkward because I said true or false afterwards, but I was asking you a question. True or false? All bryophytes are plants. That's true, which means that any characteristic that's characteristic of all plants should be found in bryophytes, right? True or false? Bryophytes are seedless. That is also true. They are in a seedless category of plants along with ferns and some others. True or false? Bryophytes are avascular or non-vascular. That is also true, right? We had this question of why can mosses, which are a type of bryophyte, grow where there is no soil? And as non-vascular plants, the non-vascular plants that they are, they don't have roots, they have rhizomes to attach, but they can attach to anything. They don't need to pull water out of soil, therefore they don't need soil. Okay, they pull water wherever. Although you still need a moist environment because they still need water. I'm not telling you they don't need water because they're non-vascular. I'm telling you they can't transport water efficiently around their tissues. Okay? True. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I remember, like, one time I was visiting Kings Canyon National Park, and there was this huge rock in the middle of a meadow.
Yeah.
It had this brown stuff on it.
Probably moss.
The moment that my dad put water on it, it turned green.
Yeah, definitely moss then. Yeah, definitely moss. And so as it was browning is because it was drying out. And so as you put some moisture in there, it now starts to, the cells that are packed full of chloroplasts start to come closer to the surface, and you start to see more of that green. All right, true or false? Bryophytes have alternation of generations. True, right? With a question mark. That is a characteristic of all plants. Bryophytes are plants, therefore bryophytes have alternation of generations. Now their dominant stage is the gametophyte stage. All other plants besides bryophyte, the dominant stage is the sporophyte stage. But for bryophytes, it's the gametophyte. All right, so now we have to start talking about how do the various types of bryophytes compare. Right, some of this you've already seen in lab. You saw liverworts versus mosses, and you're like, man, I got this. Right, liverworts. You're talking about broader leaves, look a little bit fuller and more lush, soft and pliable. Mosses, more blade-like leaves, and I got this. Okay, but let's talk about this. So we've got 3 phyla of bryophytes. The first one, Hepaticophyta, the liverworts. Hepaticophyta. These are believed to be the closest relatives to green algae. So if plants did come from green algae, the original plant form would probably be classified as a liverwort. And if it wasn't classified as a liverwort, it'd probably be very similar to liverworts, and you would feel some compulsion to classify it as a liverwort. The reasons why: they lack cuticles. They lack those waxy cuticles that help to prevent water loss. And then this is something that's just interesting. This is fairly unusual in plants to have separate sexes, where you have a male plant and a female plant. That is fairly unusual in plants. Most plants have both male and female parts. In fact, most flowers have both male and female parts in every single flower. Which is one of the reasons why, if you don't want your flowers to self-pollinate, you actually have to remove the male parts out of the flower. And you might be wondering, why on earth would I care if my flowers self-fertilize? Well, if you want the flowers to last, you can't fertilize them, otherwise they disappear and they develop into a fruit, right? I don't know if you knew that. You'll find that out next week. And then another thing, if you want to study how inheritance works, you want to increase your variety. And so you want a different individual. Anyways, we'll talk more about that next semester. This is fairly unusual for plants. These can reproduce asexually. Another reason why they're considered to be the closest relatives to green algae. That they can reproduce asexually by basically producing these structures called gymi inside of a structure in the plant. That they take cells from the plant and generate a new plant that can then be released and go and live life on its own. It's so wonderful, right? It's like, man, I want a little cat. My cat is old and tired and angry, right? Even when she's full. So it's not an issue of hanger. Like she's just mad, right? And then it's just like you take a little piece of her off and put it in this thing and it develops into a whole new cat. And a genetically identical cat to her. So you get to live her all over again, right? I mean, that just came to me. You're welcome for that. That was a great analogy. All right. Our next phylum. This is one you didn't see in lab. Anthroceratophyta, the hornworts. These are still bryophytes, meaning that the gametophyte stage is still the dominant stage. And you might be wondering, why do we care? And the answer is because you ought to. Because it's wonderful. That's all I got. All right. So the sporophyte, which you should know now, this is a bryophyte. This is not the dominant stage. This is a more transitory, more minor stage of this plant because it's a bryophyte, right? In bryophyte, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. But the sporophyte in this plant is a narrow pipe-like. It almost looks like a pipe organ. I'll show you this. I don't even know if you know what a pipe organ is. But anyways, it looks like a cylinder sticking out from the gametophyte. And it's there the entire life of the gametophyte. It's the gametophyte, the dominant life stage, the green part of the plant, and it's got this pipe or several pipes sticking out of it, and those are the sporophytes. This alternation of generations. But they're not really alternating, they just got both happening at the same time. It's kind of cheating that whole idea of alternating generations. It's like they're not alternating, both are present at the same time. Oh, man. So this thing has some structures to reduce water loss. So stomata are openings that can be closed. So you find this in a lot of plants, very rarely in bryophytes. These are openings that do a good job of allowing carbon dioxide to get into the plant. And we all know plants need carbon dioxide, right? They are producers, or they are autotrophic, right? We had that last week. And so they get their carbon from carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide needs to get into the plant's tissues. These stomata, these openings, do a wonderful job of allowing carbon dioxide to get into the plant tissue. They also do a wonderful job of letting water leave the plant tissue. So that's not ideal. But these have the ability to close these and to prevent water loss. Now we're starting to find structures that actually allow them to live a little bit more secluded from water. Additionally, you have a structure to actually shoot spores away from the plant, which is just so cool, because when you're in water, all you have to do is release it and the water will carry it away, right? Even with just a very minor current, the water will carry that away, and so you can grow a new individual somewhere else. But if you live outside of water, you don't have that ability. So they have a structure to actually launch the spores away from them to go and grow a new individual somewhere else. A new gametophyte somewhere else. It's so wonderful. And so you see this and you're like, one, that's awesome. And two, you're like, now I'm starting to understand why these aren't considered to be the most closely related to green algae, because they have some structures that really enable them to live apart from water. And if you were going to root all these plants back to green algae, you're like, man, this would take some time. Take some time to move away from water, to be comfortable away from water. And that's, of course, only assuming that you have to root them all back to green algae. But your homework for this week, because you've already posted your initial post, or you will soon, you've already read it, you know that you have to provide 3 evidences for and against plants coming from green algae. Not going to find evidences against in the textbook, but you can find plenty outside. All right. And then we've got the last phylum that's called Bryophyta. So they're all bryophytes. You have a single phylum within bryophytes called Bryophyta. Emerson.
With the homework, what's our response homework?
Oh, you have to find somebody's post and add one additional evidence against. Yeah. This is a good question. So the mosses, Bryophyta, these you find them almost everywhere. Almost everywhere. That's what cosmopolitan means. Almost a global distribution. In fact, in areas that are called the tundra, like the Arctic Circle and Antarctica, where very few things can grow, these are the dominant plant. Well, Antarctica, most of it's ice. You don't grow plants on ice, but where it's not ice and you actually have soil, you get mosses. Enormous variety and almost a cosmopolitan distribution. So these have structures like stomata that help to allow them to live, not so tied to water. A primitive vascular system, so a very simple way to move water from one cell to another. Rhizoids to hold fast to things, but their sperm are still flagellated. Are flagellated sperm going to move well in air? Think about a flagella spinning. It's like, man, you better really get that thing cooking if you're going to propel yourself through air. That'd be awesome to see. This indicates what? That what is necessary in order for mosses to reproduce? Water. So they still need water in order to reproduce, but they can function for prolonged periods of time outside of water. Like the illustration Amanda gave us, where you found this rock covered in brown. You dump water on it, now it turns green. We've got a moss. It can live isolated from water, but it can't reproduce isolated from water. Okay? Flagellated sperm do not do a good job traveling through air. Unless you launched them. All right. So here's a liverwort, broadleafs. Okay, we saw this in lab. Now here's the life cycle of a typical liverwort. I want to show you, here's the gametophyte, this dominant stage. The sporophyte is a transitory stage. And so here are spores that are made from the sporophyte. Here's, here we go. Here's the sporophyte structure producing spores. These are located on the gametophyte, okay, but they're transitory. It's a very minor stage for bryophytes. The major stage for vascular, for vascular plants, ferns and seed vascular plants. It's like, well, why does it even exist? It's a wonderful question. We'll come back to that. Okay, here are hornworts, and here are those pipes. These are the sporophytes growing off of the gametophyte. Both generations present throughout typically the entire life of the individual. Here's a figure showing the alternation of generations. Here's the gametophyte, and here's the sporophyte growing off of the gametophyte. Okay, producing spores, gametophyte producing gametes, male and female gametes. But in liverworts, the gametophyte isn't producing both male and female because sexes are separate. Remember? You remember that because we just said it. And I told you it was unusual for plants. What's that?
Since they're separate, do they like?
Yeah, that's a good question. If there's sexual dimorphism, I don't think so. Other than like the male reproductive structure versus the female, but they don't actually look different. We will find it again in another group of plants, and they certainly do look different, and they smell different. Yeah. Anyways, it's another story for next week. Don't worry, we'll talk about it. I know. You want to see it? So here are mosses. Still, these are bryophytes, so the dominant life stage is what? Gametophyte. And then the sporophyte is going to be small and transitory. I mean, it may be large, but it's a small portion of the life cycle, and it is transitory. The major portion of the plant throughout the life of the individual is a gametophyte. So here's one type of moss. Some other mosses are grow more this way. All right. So again, these are bryophytes. Dominant life stage is the gametophyte stage. Yeah.
I know we're probably going to get to this later, but what's the gametophyte then in a typical seeding?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's extremely transitory, and it usually develops very rapidly into the female producing structure on the flower, or the male producing structure on the flower. Yeah, this is a good question. We'll see that in next week. All right. Any questions here? Yeah, Autumn.
So you know the moss only grows on the north side of the tree thing?
Yeah, there's some truth to that, but it doesn't. It's not as true as you would like. So is that gonna disrupt your question?
I was just wondering if that was true, why?
It has to do with the amount of sunlight and yeah, I mean it has to do with the amount of sunlight and how it competes with other things, but it's not exactly true. Yeah.
I figured that.
Yeah.
They plant trees and they've got moss all over.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Levi.
I just had another question.
Uh-huh.
The sporophyte, the gametophyte thing.
Okay. Sporophyte, gametophyte.
Because I was kind of confused. I was watching about, like, with the trees.
Yeah.
The tree is a sporophyte, right?
Yes.
But it's not producing spores. It's still a seed plant. It's producing seeds.
Yes, it does produce spores, and those spores develop into the gametophytes, but it's retained on the individual. And so those spores develop into the gametophyte stage, which then develop into the male gametophyte. Male spore develops into the male gametophyte, which starts producing male gametes on the individual.
So it's a structure
On the sporophyte, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Oh, alright.
So here, I'll tell you this right now, and maybe that will help to shape. I don't know how well that orange, how good it looks back there. Probably not super good, but it's the only color I have on me. Sporophytes are 2N, which means that they have 2 copies of the genome. And that tends to be the norm for most eukaryotic forms. Most eukaryotic multicellular life forms have 2 entire copies of the genome, us included. The gametophyte is just N, which you all remember from algebra. If there's no coefficient written in front of it, that coefficient is 1. This has 1 copy of the genome. So this does a wonderful job generating sex cells that can go and fuse with another sex cell to form a diploid or a 2N cell, right? So if you are a massive tree and almost every cell in your body has 2 entire copies of the genome and you want to reproduce sexually, you need to generate some cell that only has 1 copy of the genome so that it can fuse with another cell that has 1 copy of the genome to make a cell that has 2 copies of the genome and will develop into a normal individual. For plants, the way they accomplish this is that they will grow the gametophyte stage on the sporophyte. This is most plants because moss is the dominant stage is the gametophyte, is only has 1 copy of the genome. But they will grow the gametophyte on their tissues that will then generate haploid cells. That can then, haploid meaning having 1 copy of the cell that then can be involved in sexual reproduction. Can go and fuse with another cell that has 1 copy of the genome and form a cell with 2 copies. Okay? So plants accomplish it with this alternation of generations. But again, most plants cheat. They have both generations present at the same time. They're not exactly alternating it like some of our bryophytes and brown algae do. All right? This question is a little bit easier to deal with, but before we do it, we're going to take a lecture break. And I'm actually going to have you spend a little bit of time talking about what you already posted for your homework assignment, or you will soon. And I want you to provide, as you discuss, I want you to give only 3 arguments in favor of plants evolving from green algae. 3 arguments in favor of plants evolving from green algae. Take a couple of minutes, talk about this with those around you, come up with some ideas. We'll talk about it collectively. 2 minutes, starting now.
So I think I said. No, we know that.
Haven't done the homework yet. But they should be using yeah. Three arguments in favor for from green algae. Oh, they're in the same like group. Should they have supposedly, yeah. They don't they have like similar structures? You're what? Oh, morphology? Oh.
Like they have what is it? Yeah, so they're in the same eukaryotic
structure. 10 seconds.
So they're in the same, like you guys said, they're in the same eukaryotic.
All right. And I mean, I can't stress this enough. Other than allowing you to have a particular experience on Friday, that there is an incredible value in knowing how to answer these questions, right? I mean, I've told you that several times, and I hope you've believed it and you've applied it. Otherwise, Friday might be a little interesting. I mean, at least an hour of Friday might be a little interesting. And by interesting, I mean not so much fun. Okay, so what are some ideas here? Give us some evidence in support of plants evolving from green algae. Do Allison and then come over here to a minute.
Some bryophytes can reproduce asexually.
Yeah, some of our groups of bryophytes can reproduce asexually. That makes sense if you actually evolve from an organism that often reproduces asexually. Yeah, Amanda.
Like they have like some similar structures.
They do, especially some of our groups of plants, right? Mm-hmm. So the land plants that are believed to be the most primitive, and that's not because they look the most like green algae, but it's because they're most tied to water, actually look a lot like green algae in some cases. Yeah, they share some features. Levi. Did you have something as well, Joe?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go Levi and then Joe.
Alternate generation.
Yeah, well, so alternations of generations you find in brown algae. We don't find them in green algae, which is it's really weird because brown algae very different chemically from land plants, but have a similar life history to plants. The green algae that are more similar chemically to plants do not. And so that actually is fuel for evidence against land plants developing or evolving from green algae. Yeah, Joe.
They both use starch as their energy source.
They do, yeah. So not as a way of storing and then accessing energy for a later point. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but starch is a glucose polymer. Okay, you string a bunch of glucose molecules together in a particular way chemically, and you form starch, which is really nice. So if you eat starchy vegetables, they're just packed full of sugar because it's very easy to break down those bonds. Starts doing it right inside of your mouth with salivary amylase. Okay, you put something starchy in your mouth, start breaking it down right away, getting access to those sugars. Good. Any other arguments in favor? Hayden.
They both share the similar photosynthetic pigments.
Yeah, they have very similar pigments used in photosynthesis. That's why they're both green, right? And unlike in the words of Kermit the Frog, it's actually really nice to be green. Okay? Because it actually allows you to absorb a large portion of the visible light spectrum. And if you reflect green light back, green light isn't particularly highly energetic light. And it's a pretty narrow range of the entire visible spectrum. And they're absorbing most of it, including the highest energy parts of that spectrum. It's good stuff. Cameron.
Is that point, the whole the color of it, that big of a pro towards?
It's a pretty big deal. I mean, it's a pretty big deal.
That are their leaves are purple.
Yeah, but they're purple for a different reason. It's not because of photosynthetic pigments. They're purple for other reasons, usually to avoid radiative heating. Because purple is the highest energy light in the visible spectrum. And so if you can reflect purple light, it actually does a great job to where it prevents you from absorbing an enormous amount of energy. Yeah. Calvin.
I've read on how the sun produces, as far as visible light goes, more green light than the other types of visible light. So it would be kind of counterintuitive for plants to reflect it because, according to what I read, it was the most abundant
Of all of the
visible light.
It's interesting. Yeah, which if that's true, and I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm just saying I would like to see the data. But if that were true, then it makes the fact that green algae and plants being green is even more interesting and would be an indication, because then you couldn't explain it away that, of course they're green because that's what's really beneficial. It would actually be better to explain it that the best explanation for why they're both green is because they came from a green ancestor. It's interesting. I'd like to see those data. Yeah, if you know where that paper is, send it to me.
Okay.
If you can find it again. Any other ideas? I can think of a couple more big ones, but I'll wait to see if you come up with them, or if you came up with them.
They're in the same super.
They are in the same supergroup. That's convenient, right? Then you can ask questions of why are they in the same supergroup. They are very similar genetically. Very similar genetically. Okay? We mentioned that a little bit on Monday, but they're very similar genetically. That's another reason to suppose that they actually do share ancestry. And then one more is that many of our groups of bryophytes, which are believed to be the most primitive land plants, their reproduction is tied to water. They cannot reproduce without water, which gives a suggestion that they are still partially tied to water, where green algae are. Well, then you have some green algae that, invade land. It's kind of a fun word to use. They invade land. It's true, but it gives you kind of it gives me a vision of like green algae marching onto land. It'd be awesome to see. Why are vascular plants larger than non-vascular plants? I'm glad you asked. Okay, now we're transitioning away from bryophytes into vascular plants. Still seedless, but vascular. So all vascular plants are put in a group called tracheophytes. This is not a phylum. If it was a phylum, it would end in tracheophyta. These are the tracheophytes. Even if it did end in tracheophyte, it wouldn't have to be a phylum. I'll give you that. But this is all of our vascular plants. There are more than 260,000 species of vascular plants. So these, unlike non-vascular plants, they have those cells that we mentioned last time, tracheids, that do a wonderful job of moving water through the plant's body. Okay? Do a wonderful job moving water through the plant's body. On top of that, they have roots that anchor the plant in place. So having roots to anchor a plant and having the ability to transmit water very efficiently through plant tissues allow you to get to be a lot bigger. Allow you to get to be a lot bigger. And you form a structure called the xylem, which is a vessel for conducting both water and nutrients through the plant's tissues. So that in the roots, you can draw nutrients and water out of the soil, and you can conduct that all over the plant through this vessel, the xylem. Does it make sense? Okay. On top of that, the last one I've already mentioned, but these vascular plants have lignin reinforced walls around every cell, and it makes the individual cells impermeable to water. They don't lose water. They do a really good job holding on to it. And then roots, we already talked about that, providing a wonderful anchor. This is something you can see this, it's true, and we'll come back to that when we go back and start talking about fungi in a couple of weeks. All right. A couple more points on vascular plants. Now the dominant stage is not the gametophyte stage, it is the sporophyte stage, which is diploid, meaning it has 2 copies of the genome. And because of its ability to anchor itself and transport water efficiently, there's just a massive amount of structure to develop a number of leaves, increasing the amount of light absorbing structures. Right? The more light you can absorb, the more photosynthesis you can carry out. That's good. It's good if you're a plant. Why is that good if you're a plant? What does photosynthesis provide a plant? Energy. I mean, the energy is coming from sunlight, but it provides the plant energy that every tissue in the plant can use, because the plant is harvesting sunlight and converting it into what? Chemical energy in the form of what? Glucose, sugar, that can then be stored in the form of what? Starch, and then can be accessed by not just the plant, but also by whom? By me. I mean, you could say us. That's fine. I'll go with me. Make sure you can have some too. Yeah. I'll share. So in some of our vascular plants, the sperm must still swim from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte, from a structure on the male gametophyte, the antheridium, to the archegonium. So some of our vascular plants are still tied to water. Although, if these 2 structures are within the same flower, then the organism can actually dump water into it and doesn't have to be stuck in that water. I have another lecture break for you to do, but yeah, Cameron, we'll address your question first.
Is it I don't know, which, if water-based plants reproduce faster than land-based plants?
It's a good question. It's not even just a matter of reproduction. It's also a matter of stability and how often. So the answer to your question is there are a number of factors that influence how rapidly an organism can reproduce. Plus, many plants that are really large don't reach sexual maturity right away. It takes them, sometimes several years to reach sexual maturity. So it's not an easy question to answer. And I say that because I'm afraid to answer your question. Yeah. I'm not really afraid.
It just seems like in the water, it's a lot less random.
Yes, yeah. I mean, sure, except, I mean, you still have to rely on the sperm getting to the right place, right? I mean, so they pick up on chemical cues, but it's not like they're little, sophisticated machines that go out and swim directly to where they need to go. I mean, so even in water, you still have a really high failure rate, where a significant percentage of the sperm never find a female gamete to fertilize. Yeah. That's true of both water and land. Okay, so we're gonna do another lecture break, and here's this question here. It's gonna come up here. We'll deal with this question a lot this semester. It's what is the relationship between diversity and complexity? So now we're starting to, I don't know if you would agree with this, but vascular plants are more structurally complex than non-vascular plants. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but it really doesn't matter. It's true. They're more structurally complex than non-vascular plants are. And so what I want you to start to think about and start to talk about is how does this relate to diversity? Is there a nice, direct, linear relationship that as complexity increases, so does diversity in a nice, predictable, linear fashion? Positive. Is it a negative linear relationship? Whereas complexity increases, diversity decreases. Or is it more complicated than that? Like maybe exponential or logarithmic? Or what are some other curves? What's that? Sinusoidal, right? I don't even know how you could generate that from this. But spend a little bit of time talking about this, and then we'll talk about this together. All right? 2 minutes, starting now.
What is the reverse relate to complexity?
Any evidence that has
I mean, unless you can think of an example where there's like as something else diverse, or as something else more diverse. That doesn't really make sense.
No, it does.
It does?
Yeah.
Something can be more diverse but less complex.
Yeah. If they might remember Lotus, you have some that are just simple. You have a lot of useful ones.
Yeah, but that would be like, since there is greater diversity now, there is much more complexity.
Yeah.
I don't understand how something would be more diverse but less complex. Like it's things that, I don't know. I can't do it.
They could be, but
All right. So in order to answer this question, we need to do what every good biologist and every good mathematician would do. We need to come up with some units for our graph, right? Because we've got complexity on one axis, we've got diversity on the other, but how on earth are we even going to quantify this? How would you quantify complexity? Yeah?
Something that we were talking about is like how complexity seems to like encompass like the individual, whereas diversity is more like individuals like interacting with everything else, I guess.
It's true. Yeah.
So, like, maybe to quantify like how a particular species is more complex in itself, but then you have to like consider a bunch of different species, so that's kind of complicated.
Yeah. I completely agree. It's not easy to quantify this. I have some ideas, which probably doesn't surprise you, Tara.
Maybe like number of structures.
Number of structures, I like that. Number of, let's do this, tissues. Rather than just saying generally structures, let's use something that has some very specific meaning, right? Tissues, collection of cells of different types, coordinating their activity for some function. Yeah, Allison.
The size of the genome?
Size of the genome. Good, I like that. Size of the genome. Any other ideas on how we might quantify complexity? Yeah.
Maybe
Okay. Like number of types? Variety of reproductive mechanisms. I don't know if you can tell this or not, but the wall is darker here. It's because I write on here, but I got in trouble for that. So there's an M and another S. I don't want to write on the wall anymore. And I would suggest that there's one more, I think, really helpful way to do this, and to do this. The number of interactions per cell. So more complex organisms then are going to have more sophisticated cellular communication, right? More interactions per cell. That makes sense? Okay. Now diversity, how do we quantify this? There are a number of ways you can do this. Some are fairly simple. Autumn.
The number of organisms.
Okay, so let's do this. Number of species. Because number of organisms, I mean, that could be like, are they all the same type, right? Number of species. Good. Any other ideas? Okay, Allison.
type or number of environments?
Okay. Number of environments. Where you mean where you find that organism?
Right.
Number of environments. How do we inhabited? Let's say that. Inhabited. Any other thoughts? Then we can go with, how do we do this curve? Mia.
Maybe like something about how the number of species are grouped, like how many are groups.
Okay. So let's do this. Number of taxa. So taxa, those are the groupings, right? They're the drawers in the file cabinet, or the folders in the file cabinet, or the bigger folders that the smaller folders sit in inside the file cabinet. Okay? All right, now what do we think? What do you think about this relationship? Do we think that it's this? Or something along those lines? As we increase in complexity, we increase in diversity? Or do we think it's something more like this? Okay? Or you offered sinusoidal, right?
No.
Now you're not committed? But is it something more like this? Right? Sinusoidal? Or is it something more like this? Logarithmic. Getting all kinds of fancy math curves involved here in our bio class. What do we think? So let's deal with, do we think that there's a positive relationship? As complexity increases, do you think diversity increases? Yes or no? All in favor of yes, raise your hand. And why do we think yes? I would agree with you. I would say yes. And I've seen the data, right? Calvin and we had a conversation. I said I wanted to see the data. I've seen the data, and the data support it, but it also makes sense. Because if you're more complex, you should be, as Allison put here, be able to live in a higher variety of different environments, which would also increase your diversity, but would facilitate having more taxa, right? More species. That makes sense, right? So, and I've seen the data, and the data support it. But now how do we think, is it linear? Is it exponential? And I've provided you some clues on the graph. There's only one curve that is solid. The rest are dashed. Okay, which means maybe, yes. Okay, we seem to have this logarithmic relationship that as complexity increases, so does diversity until it reaches a certain point. And you get to a certain point where it starts to level off because you probably maximized what is possible. Because it doesn't really matter how complex your tissues are, you're also inhibited by the complexity of your entire environment. And space. And time. Right? This is awesome. Look at this. Look at all those, I mean, the sinusoidal curve's trying to stick around, it should be gone. I'm pretty sure you said it as a joke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, I don't want to just dismiss your idea, but yeah, Levi.
So how did you end up defining those terms?
How did we, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you define it, you're going to end up with basically that same logarithmic curve. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. You need some way to quantify it, but quantifying any of those ways are going to give you basically the same relationship. All right. So we need to finish this last question. Which are considered the most derived seedless vascular plant? Seedless, still seedless plants, but vascular. So Tracheophytes are still seedless, still restricted to moist environments. A little bit more separated from water than Bryophytes, but still restricted to moist environments. And we can divide them into two phyla, bless you, both of which we saw in lab. Like a Podiophyta, the club mosses. We're going to see some terms again you're not emotionally ready to handle yet, but they're here, so you have these pieces of information. Dominate the Carboniferous, forming large swampy forests. And we're going to come up, and next week we're going to hit the fossil record and talk about all these terms, but I want you to have this information. Sporophylls, structure that you find now, the dominant stage is now sporophyte, not gametophyte. Sporophylls, place where you can generate different structures, are arranged in strobili. Strobili, sorry. And then we've got monilophyta. These are horsetails, whisk ferns, and ferns. And this is believed to be the most derived, which means furthest away from the ancestors. So of all of our groups of seedless plants, this phylum here, monilophyta, is believed to be the most derived or furthest away from the ancestors. And so in here we have three classes. We've got our horsetails, we have whisk ferns, and we have the true ferns. And of these three groups, the true ferns are believed to be the most derived or the furthest away from the ancestor. Which would mean you would predict that they would be the most different of all of these seedless plants from what? What's the believed ancestor of plants? Green algae. They should be the most different structurally and the most different genetically. And what do you think you find?
They're not.
They are. They're the most different structurally and they're the most different genetically. Providing maybe an additional argument in favor of plants evolving from green algae. But we have to deal with all the evidences against. So these appear, that is this group believed to be the most derived, the least like green algae, structurally, genetically, appear in the Devonian, have leaves with the reproductive structures on top of them. The dominant stage here is the sporophyte. You've got these structures where the gametophyte resides, and these are what are called homospores. They make both male and female spores that develop into both male and female gametophytes on the individual. And so we had a fern in lab last week, and you had a picture of a fern with those sori underneath in the photo atlas. Okay, those are the gametophytes. I mean, they're the structures that are forming spores, but the spores develop into gametophytes and then are able to facilitate sexual reproduction. All right? So this is interesting. The plants, the seedless plants that are most unique from green algae structurally are also the most unique genetically. We have to come up with some way to explain that if we do not believe that plants and green algae share a common ancestor. We have to come up with some alternative explanation for that. But the wonderful thing about plants, which we'll talk about a lot next week, not on Friday, because on Friday we'll have an exam and we won't talk at all. In fact, I hate to tell you this, but I probably won't even be here during your exam. I like to, I like to not proctor exams. Is really, I should say I don't like to proctor exams. So I probably won't even be here, so we won't talk. But we'll talk a lot about this next week. There are a lot of reasons to suppose that plants do not share ancestry with green algae. But genetic arguments, these are going to be tough. That's going to be a tough argument to try to use that to go against. Instead, you have to come up with an alternative explanation. All right? Any questions? Thoughts? Okay, remember these are not bryophytes, so what is the dominant life stage? Sporophyte, and not what? Gametophyte, because that's what the bryophytes have, all right? Have a wonderful Wednesday. Yes, ma'am.